Innotribe, please welcome Director of Kapronasia, Zenon Capron.
Thank you, everyone. When I moved to China 11 years ago, I actually used mobile payments. It's something that people don't know necessarily about China, as China invented gunpowder, tea, and mobile payments. And I used mobile payments on a device not dissimilar to this. When I needed to pay my rent every month, I needed to go to my bank, take out cash, put it in a paper bag, walk it across the street to my landlord's bank, and deposit it in his account. Today, things have changed. Today, I have my Xiaomi mobile phone that's made by a Chinese manufacturer. On this mobile phone, I pay my current landlord, who lives in France, who's Chinese, who lives in France, using Alipay. I invest in financial products launched by Baidu, a search engine, not unlike Google. And I use wealth management products from Tencent. Nowhere in the world do we see this integration of technology and finance that we're seeing today in China. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. We're talking about how 3 companies are changing the way that 1.4 billion people bank, and the changes that it could have for the global economy as well. With me today to help guide us through this journey of what is happening in China and more in Asia and this fintech revolution about big fintech, Bernard Lun, who is the founding partner of Daily Fintech Advisors, and Hayden Shaughnessy, who's the co-founder of Disruption House. Hayden couldn't be here with us today, but he's joining us with Skype from Ireland today. So before we get started into the actual content, we wanted to find out what you, the audience, think about what's happening in the market. So we have 3 polling questions over the session today. The first polling question, which is going to be coming up on the screen just now, is where will fintech disruption come from? Now, as you came in, you'll have the little clickers, some people have found theirs, that were on your seats. Please take out those clickers. The question is, where will the fintech disruption come from? So Innotribe Sibos this week is all about disruption. We want to know from you, do you think this is going to come from the West, from China, India, other, or none at all? So please vote now. So clearly the people that are coming to this session already agree with us that the true disruption is going to come from China. And that's really the story that we have to talk about today. Because China is changing the way that they bank and the world eventually could bank. Before we get into the details of what's happening with the big fintech companies, let's talk a little bit about where China is today. China today is the world's biggest land grab. You have 1.5 billion people that are competing for scarce resources, whether that be money, housing, technology, jobs, everything in China. You have an increasingly wealthy middle class, but there have been a lot of sacrifices that have been made for economic growth. So it's a developing country with modern problems of obesity, pollution, income distribution, healthcare, and Starbucks, a scourge in China today. So essentially, we're coming to China with this dichotomy. On one side, you have all these problems, but on the other side, there is a Starbucks on every 3 blocks. The adoption of mobile phone technology, saturation is nearly 100%. Smartphone saturation, very similar. So this dichotomy of what China is. So it's within this space that we're seeing the biggest shifts in how a population interacts with the financial industry anywhere. And why is that happening? Because if you look at the technology companies in China today, they're very good at what they do. Baidu owns the search market. Alibaba owns the e-commerce market. Tencent, if you use the WeChat application, there's 400, 500 million people that are chatting on WeChat every day. So increasingly, as these companies reach saturation in their own home markets, in their own kind of niche areas of the Chinese market, they're increasingly moving into other spaces. So if we look at Baidu, search and advertising is their core business, and now they're expanding into banking, financial products, and payments. If we look at Tencent fundamentally started out as a gaming communications company. Now they're moving into banking, taxis, and movie tickets. And Alibaba, probably the most well-known of this group. E-commerce started off with e-commerce and has now moved into payments and taxis as well. So the story here is that technology firms are seeing the opportunity in financial services, and they're moving into it. And they're coming at it from a different direction from the banks. So all of the banks are here, and they're talking about, oh, what we're doing in technology. It's almost like the bank is backing into technology. Here in China, we have technology companies that are going straight into banking, and it's really changing the game. Fundamentally, these are built on three main factors: big data, platforms, and regulators. So increasingly, we're seeing companies like Baidu and Alibaba leveraging big data to create products within the financial industry. We talked about Baidu creating a financial product that we'll talk about a little bit more on the stock market. You have Alibaba moving into credit. These are all on platforms. On WeChat, I can do any of these things. I can book a taxi, I can buy movie tickets, I can do wealth management products, and it's enabled by regulators. Unlike our other markets where regulators are sometimes holding back fintech, in China, they're enabling fintech. They're enabling fintech to be set up, the private banks to be set up. They're pushing Alibaba to get into credit. And this is really changing the game in China. The BAT, or Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, are part of everyday lives. If you haven't used WeChat, or if you have a Western version of the WeChat, you may not see this. But this is what the average Chinese and myself see when we open up the application, except for the Chinese, it would be in Chinese. But the amount of functionality that's on this platform is incredible. Not only can you send money back and forth between your friends within the chat application, you can top up your mobile phone, you can order a taxi. You can use virtual currency. QQ coins were probably the world's most adopted virtual currency until Bitcoin. Lucky Money, movie tickets, Go Dutch. You can see all of these things are coming together on one platform, and that's incredible. The effect that this is having on society is changing everything. We did for the purposes of this session and the report that we published, we did a survey of 1,000 millennials in China, and we asked them various questions about how they interact with social media and how they interact with their banks. How often do you use WeChat? 0% do not use WeChat of the people that we talk to. 82% use it several times a day. I would fall into that 82%. I use it to communicate with my staff, but I also use it for payments. I use it for paying my staff. I use it for wealth management myself. It's a little bit cut off, but what do you use WeChat for? So 61% said mostly to keep in touch with my friends, but you can see how it's starting to get into other areas, how they use it to run their business. Like me, I use it to run my business, to do my payments and to buy things. And there's a couple people that, 0% that do not use WeChat. So you can see how these platforms are changing the way that people interact in China with their financial institution. But talking just about China and the changes that are happening here would be leaving another 1 billion people off the table. We're seeing how these 1.4 billion people in China interact with their organizations. Bernard's going to walk us through how India interacts with their financial industry.
Great. Thanks very much, Zenon. So this is mostly about China, but I was asked to give a few words to contrast what is happening in India. And one simple contrast is if you look and say, you ask the question of who is the Google of China? It's Baidu. Who is the Facebook of China is Renren. Who is the Twitter of China is Weibo. But you ask that same question in India, and you get a totally different answer. The Google of India is, guess what? Google. The Facebook of India is Facebook. The Twitter of India is Twitter. All of these are global/American companies that have become leaders within India. And that's probably one reason why when Narendra Modi, who's the current Prime Minister of India, did a recent trip to Silicon Valley, he was welcomed with very open arms by all of the US tech titans. They line up to meet Modi. That's the headline, because the market is very, very open to those Western companies moving in. So that's one fundamental, simple difference between the two countries. When we actually come to look at banking and payments, it's a bit different. When we look at banking and payments, India does want to control it a lot more. This is a list of 11 new banks that were licensed in India in 2015 by the Reserve Bank of India. It was a very specific form of license called a payment license. And that by itself is quite interesting. It was all about financial inclusion. You've got 1 billion people, huge number of those are completely left out of the economic system. and the Indian government wants to have more of them within the banking system. So if you look at those 11, one of the interesting things, only one is a foreign company, Vodafone, which happens to have been doing business for a long time in India, happens to be also the company that first created M-Pesa, so guess how they're going to be doing banking in India. When you go through that list, some big names of sort of famous companies that are famous of you in India, Reliance is one of the biggest companies in India, and a couple of individual names. There's a guy called Vijay Shekhar Sharma. Doesn't mean much to anybody in this room, I assume. But he is the founder of a company called 197, which created a mobile wallet called Paytm. And it's a mobile wallet that happens to solve a very simple problem. Because actually, if you ask one slightly different question, which is, who is the Amazon of India, you do start to get a slightly different answer. Maybe it's Flipkart. And Flipkart, which is now valued at about $15 billion, started with one very simple question, which is, if there is a delivery coming to the home, which is typically what you'd expect in e-commerce, and the person taking delivery doesn't have a credit card, how does that person pay? Flipkart said, you've got to pay in cash. So if you pay in cash, they figured out the logistics of somebody paying in cash, literally folding notes and having to take that back and do all of that logistics. And they grew to be a very valuable business by doing that. But then along came mobile wallets. And that's why, actually, you could ask in the future, maybe a slightly different question is, who is the Paytm of America? Because the reason that, and there are other companies doing mobile wallets, and some of them may overtake Paytm, but Paytm at the moment looks like a leader in this area, because when that delivery comes to the door and you don't have enough cash because the ATM is miles away, you don't have a credit card, you get out your mobile phone, the person delivery guy gets his mobile phone, transaction done. It is solving a very real and fundamental problem, and that's how innovation takes place, when it's solving a real problem, because the mobile wallets, to my knowledge, in America and Europe are not solving a burning problem. In India, they happen to be solving a burning problem. And that is the problem that they're solving. But one of the key takeaways here is that this is a story about China and India. You know, in the West, we do like to talk about China versus India, which one has got a bigger GDP, and so on and so forth. But to business people, that's not the question. The question is, who do I do a deal with? China and India do an awful lot of trading together. Right now, one of the biggest deals that has happened is Alibaba making a big investment into Paytm. About $300 million, I think it was September 29th, a fairly recent deal. So that is an example of where it is China plus India working together to bring some of the new innovation to the table. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Hayden Shaughnessy, all the way over in Ireland. He's the co-founder of Disruption House, and he will take it from here.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I actually think that it's about China, India, and Africa. You know, I think it's about half the world's population that are being set up to do business through small businesses, and those small businesses function on business platforms very much like Alibaba. I think that one of the big missing ingredients for the banks is that to function within this new platform centric economy, you really need a lot of process change. And I think that that's partly about how do you respond to competitors. I think banks are fairly confident about that. They can compete with their existing competitors and with fintech, they can just buy fintech. But I think that where they are complacent is really not thinking about how they do process change. And the excuse tends to be, well, we have legacy technology and therefore we need to re-platform. So we'll spend the next 5 years doing that and looking at this greenfield opportunity called blockchain. But I think if you look at what's actually happening in the economy, if you look at how important small businesses are becoming, for example, and how important platforms are becoming, then you see this kind of polarization of the economy between super platforms and small businesses, and the small businesses are the real dynamic of the changing economy. And that kind of combination, the technology, I think also coupled to new user needs. Most banks' commercial customers have quite different needs from what they had 5 years ago. And entrepreneurial innovation really favor this platform model. In The Elastic Enterprise, a book I wrote about 4 years ago, I said about platforms that they're a new enterprise operating system. And that's exactly what they are, because we've had bureaucratic enterprise systems, we've had industrial enterprise systems, manufacturing enterprise systems. What we haven't really come to terms with is that the platform is a new enterprise operating model. And coincidentally, or wisely, these platforms, particularly the China platforms, are just extraordinarily well set up to provide a low-cost global platform for smaller businesses. They do that very deliberately. When Jack Ma was setting Alibaba up, he said, we don't hunt for whales, we fish for prawns. We don't go trying to compete head-to-head with American giants. We go elsewhere and we look for where these smaller opportunities are, and we scale them up. If you look at the degree of integration, I think as well, you've got something that's quite special. It began as the platform for small businesses. It enabled small business trade. But it also started out as a financial service. From the very beginning, it had escrow services. So that's where Alipay began. It's now providing working capital to manufacturers, and it provides credit to consumers. So it's actually funding the whole value chain. If you look at one of the really interesting areas that it's involved in as well, if you look at logistics, its ambition is to create a global 3-day logistics facility. And it's doing that through things like its investment in Singapore Post. I think it has investments in Russian logistics. It's invested in supply chain finance companies, supply chain finance software, basically setting up a facility for a new generation of businesses, not just in China, as we've heard from Bernard, also in India, I suspect also in Africa, and I suspect in other areas of this growing corridor of south-to-south trade. On top of all that, though, it's going into this O2O area, the online to offline, so that you get the ability to go and buy a ticket to an event. You can then go and book your ride to get to that event. And if you don't want to go out, you can rent a movie for them. So they're actually continuing to create these adjacencies and continue to integrate more and more services that are all payments related. Now, I think that the big issue for banks is this movement gets more momentum through governments mandating electronic procurement from their own budgets. So the tendency is that companies are having to move towards platforms in order to do electronic billables and receivables. So even though there is this dynamic in the market to go towards the platform, there is now this new impetus to go there because of government procurement rules. We've talked about Alibaba, but look at SAP and Ariba, because what Ariba began as was a procurement system. It now has a payment layer, Ariba Pay. It is just opening up a working capital channel, accepting and processing working capital from partners, and it's about to open a set of APIs to facilitate other financial services to what is, in effect, the biggest procurement platform in the world. Where we go next with this, I think, is that you'll get things like FX services, and I think you will get things like currency management on these platforms. And we have that model in Ripple. What Ripple has taught us is that you can do competitive FX in line, as it were. In line, as a transaction is taking place, you can create a marketplace for automated FX. It's not going to take Amazon or Alibaba long to figure how to incorporate that into their platforms. It's not going to take Ariba Pay long to figure out how it can incorporate currency management into that kind of inline comprehensive service either. So where does it leave banks? I think where it leaves banks is where I started, that you really have to think about, how do I change my processes? How do I change my processes so that I can integrate with platforms, or I can become the platform? And what most banks suffer from is having IT as infrastructure rather than as business drivers, and having corporate comms that doesn't allow you to market outside of your existing brand. You are DBS, you are RBS, you are Citi. What you really need to be doing is to be branding very specific services like, I am the best FX service, the best currency management service in the world. And my name is no longer DBS, it's, I don't know, some other branded term. So the kind of things that you need to do are very process orientated, and they're very much dependent on the ability to move away from the silos. And the silos, I want to emphasize once more, the silos are not really about technology. The silos are about people. Banks are, I think, avoiding this reality, seeing blockchain and fintech as a kind of greenfield site where they can go and build something new, and avoiding the reality that their own brownfield site, their own existing site, is really not a technology challenge, but is a people challenge. So on to the next slide. I just talk very, very briefly on the next slide about, yeah, great. What you face when you go into the platform world, I think, is a level of capability that we really haven't seen anywhere else in any industry. So if you look at Alibaba at peak time, on the 11th of the 11th last year, Alibaba processed at peak 80,000 transactions in 1 second. So here we're dealing with what you might say is a kind of degree of scale that's unprecedented, but you have to find ways to start working at this scale, and a degree of scope in the range of services that's unprecedented. So new economies of scale and new economies of scope. But actually what Alibaba manages to do is to create all this with existing web technologies. It's not gone to blockchain, it's not gone to anything other than what every other company uses on the web. It's things like Red Hat Linux, it's some Oracle, it's Hadoop clusters, it's MapReduce, it's the common open source technologies that are available to everybody, but architected in a way, not just as a technology, but as a business process that allows them to perform at extraordinary scale. Partly why it's able to do that is it does not give the IT department too much power. So it is not a Silicon Valley culture where the developer is king. It's a Chinese culture where the business is king, and business leaders set the ambition. Business leaders want new features, then they want new apps, or they want new areas of the platform to be developed, and the internal developer community just has to respond to it. So what they would tend to do, I think it's true to say that the developers within Alibaba do actually lead innovation, but they lead innovation in this mad rush to make this new scale function with a very shaky kind of infrastructure where the mobile network is not always that good. So they're constantly pressed with novel problems of scale, and that's where their energies are absorbed. So they're trying constantly to kind of reduce the footprint of IT so that the service can grow exponentially. And what that means, I think, is that it's an entirely different world for the developer, and it's an entirely different world from the kind of lauding of the developer community that you see in Silicon Valley. For example, there is no Google time. There's no 20% where a smart developer can go and do something new and present it to the business. The developer who wants to get on is in a Darwinian struggle to somehow show that they have answers that their peers don't have. So you've got this, I think, totally different business culture, totally different IT culture, but I think the two seem to work together very well. What they aim for is to deliver at all costs, and that's, again, it's something that if you look inside a bank in general, what you're going to find is turf war between IT, the business, marketing, and comms. But here, I think there's no room for it. So to conclude my little section of this, I think that what you have to do if you're a bank is learn how to compete in this environment, and the only way to do that is very rapid process change. It's also to understand that you're in a race to be part of the platform, to serve the platform, or to be the platform. And if you don't learn these things very quickly, then it's very difficult to see what your future is. You know, it's not to say that you're doomed, but it's very difficult to see what your future is. It's simple enough to concoct or create a platform strategy, but it's not easy to see what you do if you don't do that. And I think that finally, that the biggest lesson, I think, is that this is not about the technology, though you are focused on the technology. It's about the people and it's about the processes. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Zenon and talk a little bit later about more of the changes in the global market structure.
Thanks, Hayden. So some of the things that Hayden pulled out are obviously the things that banks need to look at. And really that speed and that change is something that's happening in China. It's really cutthroat, and it's really winner take all in all these spaces. Hayden also pointed out a number of things that the technology companies are using to disrupt the competition. And for our second polling question for today, we'd again like to go out to you, to the audience. What do you think will disrupt finance in the long run? Bitcoin, blockchain technology, big tech in the form of Apple, Facebook, Google, Alibaba, Amazon, mobile, or other, or none at all? Please vote now. So we can see we're in agreement again. This is the best audience ever. Big tech driving change. Blockchain, interesting if you had attended the session earlier today about how blockchain is changing banking, or has the potential of changing banking. So we've looked at big tech, we've looked at China today, we've looked at India today. Let's take a moment and go forward into the future. Thank you, and welcome back. It feels like ages since we've been talking to each other. When we look back in 2020 on what's happened previously, we'll see what Baidu has done in big data as being one of the center points of how financial technology is going to change the industry. If you haven't paid attention to this, 6 years ago in the year 2014, Baidu set up their BiFi 100 product. This product is based off big data. It's based off search information. It's based off algorithms on their search data, combined with the CSI 100. If you're not familiar with that, the CSI 100 is essentially the S&P 500 for the Shanghai market. This product is built off big data. Baidu has done what Google, what Yahoo, what the other global giants in search haven't done, and has taken data and put it to use within the financial industry. This product, up until the market growing and kind of exploding over the past 6 months, this product, over the first 6 months of its life cycle, had beaten the market by 6%, just using big data. And that change is really, the use of big data within the financial industry in China is changing the way that people bank. Because these products are open for everybody. It's essentially democratizing finance. I can use that wealth management product on my phone, and I can invest 100 renminbi into a wealth management product. If you talk about a wealth management product in the US or the UK, the barrier to entry is much, much higher. Hayden pointed at this as well. If we look at the Alibaba ecosystem, if we look at what they've done so far and where they're going, and you can see at the bottom here some of the investments that they've already made into all of these different sections, online to offline, education, media, entertainment, logistics. If you followed Alibaba since its IPO, you know that the stock is way down, and one of the things that management did, I think, late last week, early this week, was set up a website to the Alibaba Explainer, or basically what does Alibaba do outside. And too often in the West, we look at Alibaba and we see e-commerce. What you don't see behind that is all of this, the way that they're making a digital empire. There's a movie theater in Beijing right now that's the film company is partially owned by Alibaba. Alibaba has invested in the movie theater. Guess what? You can go onto Alipay, you can buy your movie ticket, you can go to the theater, you can show a QR code, and you can get into the movie. It's not even online to offline now, it's online to online. They've closed the loop on some of this. Education, they have programs that are enabling Chinese students to study abroad and support them as they go abroad. Entertainment, we've talked about before, they're invested in football, they're invested in movies, they're invested in TV and logistics. The rate that these models are expanding already, 5 years before in 2015, is impressive. And that's really what's going to provide the value, because in behind all of this is the finance aspect. In behind all of this is Alipay. When I buy that movie ticket, I'm using Alipay to do that. What's also changing is the move into banking. You can see in the top right-hand corner, My Bank. This is a huge shift in the Chinese banking industry. The Chinese government a couple of years ago recognized that having completely state-owned banks maybe wasn't in the best interest for a free market economy where they want to get to. So they set up a program to set up private banks in China. 5 initiatives with 10 companies, two companies for each partnership, were brought together to set up private banks in China. My Bank from Alibaba has already launched. WeBank from Tencent has already launched as well. So think about the implications here. You have these platform, big data, e-commerce companies that have infrastructure that's built agile. This infrastructure is primed for digital banking. Forget about the discussions about how banks are going to move to digital banking. These truly are the first digital banks in the world. So if we look at China, just a couple of quick conclusions on China before we move to India, and a couple comments from Hayden. We will look back at China's financial industry as the most innovative globally. I can guarantee anything that you hear any of these fintech startups talk about today, and any of the startup challenges, come to me and I'll tell you how they're doing it in China already and how some of this stuff is live. The adoption of mobile payments, everything. Regulators are allowing and in some cases driving this innovation. The private banks that I mentioned before, that was an initiative that was driven by the regulators because they realized that it had to change. The Alibaba credit scoring system, the People's Bank of China realized, hey, our credit database covers half the population and only half of that actually has transaction information. They pushed credit ratings to the BATs, to the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent to drive that because they realized that these guys can potentially do it better than they can. These companies, these 3 companies, are set to forever change the industry, at least in China and potentially globally. The way that they're addressing finances, they're coming to it from a technology perspective and not a banking perspective. Banking is something that they're wrapping around the technology, and that's enabling them to come with a very agile, a very flexible network and infrastructure to do the adjacency plays that Hayden talked about, to create those platforms and create those networks. And it's solutions that fit the government's path of reform, the economic reform and reform of the industry as a whole. If you look at what the government did with Bitcoin a couple of years ago, very quickly they cut it off. Why did they cut it off? Because it didn't help the industry. It didn't solve any problems in the industry. Peer-to-peer lending, on the other hand, has been in China since 2010 online. It's been in China for decades informally. Why hasn't the government regulated before? Because it solved an issue. Shadow banking is a serious issue in China. Peer-to-peer lending doesn't completely solve that, but it helps. It brings these loans out of the shadows and into the light. And so these things that are helping the industry, these innovations, these reforms that help the industry, the government is allowing. And that approach is very different. Will consumers care about privacy? Is it too late? A friend of mine who used to work for Microsoft and Intel said to me after I showed him my Chinese mobile phone, he says, you know, Zenon, all of your data is going to Beijing. Does that worry you? And I said, no, you know, I feel good that somebody's looking after me, that somebody cares about me in Beijing. But the question of privacy, does it matter in China? Obviously, what Baidu has done and been able to use big data, they're aggregating search information. It's not personal search information, but they're aggregating search information. But does that influence in privacy? If Google did the same thing, would they be able to do it in another market? Maybe, maybe not. But is it too late? Right now, can Chinese consumers actually take back that privacy, or do they care about that privacy in general? There's a famous saying, crossing the river by feeling the stones is the path to reform. And that's the way China has been for the past 15, 20 years since the Great Opening in the 1970s. What we're seeing today is crossing the river by building a high-speed train. Big fintech is changing the industry in China and changing it quickly and in a big way. That's what's happening in China in the future. Let's talk to Bernard about what's happening in India in the future.
Right, thanks very much, Zenon. Hope everybody's enjoying being in 2020. We will get there in about 5 years, perhaps not quite as fast as we did it here today. The question right now is what is happening in India today? And one of the things that's happening is big investments. One of the biggest is Flipkart. About $3 billion has been invested into Flipkart because they figured out how to do e-commerce in a country that didn't have a lot of credit cards. And if you look at, that's mostly American money. It's American venture capital money flowing into Flipkart. The other company that's attracted a lot of money is the one we talked about earlier, which is Paytm. Much smaller sum of money, about 600 million, of which about 300 million of which was actually in the last couple of weeks from Alibaba. And what's interesting about that also is that all of that money has come either from India or from China. It hasn't come from the West. So here's one of the biggest innovations happening, and the West has not been investing in it. I don't know if they weren't invited, or for whatever reason, the money is coming from within Asia to fund the investments that are coming out there. So right now, that's what's happening, big investments. And one of the reasons for big investments is there are a lot of obstacles. India is far, far behind China in GDP, in adoption of technology, in bandwidth, and all kinds of things. But it has over 1 billion people, and the demographics, as we'll look at later, are very good in India. So now also the focus, if you look at the government in India right now, Narendra Modi's government, they are focused on a couple of big things. One of the biggest they're focused on, which they've made, in my belief, a lot of progress already, is corruption and bureaucracy. If you've done business in India, and I first started going to India back in 1994, and I've lived there and I've done business there, and the corruption and bureaucracy is bad. That's one of the big issues that the government is already tackling, and in my view, making serious headway into that. As we looked at earlier, they're also getting competition in the banking market for a very simple reason: financial inclusion. They will get GDP growth and economic growth if the mass of the people move up into a global middle class. And that requires innovation in banking, finance, and they're making that happen. One area which they know they have to do, but they're not doing enough yet, frankly, is deregulation that can make the country more entrepreneur-friendly. It's still not an easy place to start and run a business. It could be an awful lot easier. Any rankings of that, India falls way down the bottom of the charts. Obviously, one would also like a free-floating currency. Probably people in China might want that too. And things like digital inclusion and bandwidth. Very, very good in terms of basic cell phone coverage. Works a treat. But overall, large-scale bandwidth, it falls down a lot on. Now, it's no secret to anybody in this room, we're in Singapore, we're in Asia, this is the Asian century. That's a Captain Obvious statement. I think everybody accepts that. And that also, that's all about demographics. And the thing about India is very big population today, growing very fast. One of the estimates says 1.4 billion by 2025. So another 10 years from today, or another 5 years from the today that we're pretending we're in today. And that would be more than China, according to this estimate. Now, who knows estimates like that? But the key thing is that under 50% of those are under 25 years. This is a very young population. And that is a big demographic trend to bet on. Now, the other thing I'd like to do, if you look at the Asian century, India, China, there are obviously many other countries within Asia, but these are the two big economies, is putting what's happened in August in China into some perspective. Because as we were getting ready to do this talk, people said to me, yeah, well, China, that just crashed, didn't it? Yes, there was a big stock market crash in China. But if you just put that in perspective to, say, 1929 to 1936 in America, that was a far, far worse crash. And what happened? America was the biggest economy in the 20th century. So just put that in perspective and put it past. It's not a big deal. And one of the reasons it's not a big deal is that most Chinese are not invested in the stock market. It's not their primary source of wealth. So if there's a big up and a down in that market, okay, some speculators might lose some money, but it's not a huge deal. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Hayden for some concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernard. So if you want to strain your necks to the left. I think there will be only 10 companies that matter by 2020. I think we'll be looking forward to 2025 at that stage anyway. But there'll just be these 10 companies that will be that pole, the polar opposites I mentioned earlier. It might surprise you, but I think that one of the most important companies by then will be General Electric, which is 120, 130 years old. But over the past 5 years under Jeff Immelt, General Electric has gone to extraordinary lengths to convert itself into a software-driven enterprise. So the future of General Electric, which makes turbine engines, is actually the data around the turbine engines. So General Electric have done a superb job. They are, as it were, in a position that the banks were in 5-10 years ago, and they've done it. They've converted by hook or by crook. They've managed to get their developers to think differently, or their programmers to become developers. I think the other companies will be people like Xiaomi and Samsung in hardware, Ericsson in infrastructure, Apple and Google, of course. They're already huge number of adjacencies that work inside those companies. Amazon and Facebook are going to be there as well. But you look around the financial sector, of course, Alipay and Tencent, without doubt. But you look around the financial sector and you just wonder, is any bank really ready for this future? Maybe Citi. Maybe it's a China bank, maybe it'll be Santander. It's difficult to say, but I think that the most important thing is that huge amounts of trade will flow through the platforms owned by these people, directed by the content that's searchable by engines like Baidu and Google. So we are going to see a very different economy, and at the Disruption House, we do a bit of analysis around that. We try and track what we think the future money flows would be. And these are not money flows in the sense of financial derivatives where they're not that closely related to real production. So if you look at real production, take something like direct e-commerce. We have currently a global cross-border trade flow of round about, in total, all goods, round about 17 trillion. Alibaba reckons that direct e-commerce, so going from a producer of a good to the consumer of that good without any intermediation whatsoever, will be a $1 trillion business by 2020. I think that's an underestimate. I think that's Alibaba thinking that it's going to dominate and it's going to be, the 1 trillion is going to be Alibaba's 1 trillion. I think it'll be more than that. If you look at O2O businesses, offline to online, online to offline, you're already seeing extraordinary amounts of money being sucked out of local economies into large platforms. It could be an Uber or the Chinese version of an Uber or an Amazon marketplaces, or it can be, I suppose, Alibaba as well. So again, a huge diversion of money from the local economy to the global economy. If you look at B2B platform trade, Frost & Sullivan reckon that something like 6.7 trillion of business will be conducted through platforms by 2020. I think that possibly half of that, maybe not quite, but a good chunk of that will be cross-border trade. So again, you see a large diversion of the way in which things are made and sold. I suppose, have been in the grip of, for the last 25 years, the big move to supply chain networks. We're now in some other paradigm, and maybe it's the new distribution network. Maybe we're slowing down on supply chain. We certainly are. If you look at the data, supply chains are becoming less significant as a portion of overall trade. So maybe it's to do with this new distribution network. And if you look at SME internationalization, I think I mentioned earlier, every single country that you look at, the kind of growth, small businesses now dealing in 6 currencies, or small businesses now, the fastest growing small business actually, now looking at 50% of their revenues coming from cross-border sales. So in every sense, if you look at all that and you say, well, we're in a 17 to $20 trillion economy by 2020, 50% of that economy will be shaped entirely differently. And that 50% will very much be at the mercy of the platform. And I think it's incumbent on the banks to start thinking, okay, my customers clearly need something else other than the kind of services I'm offering now. Platforms are offering it. What will be my role? And with that, back to Zenon.
Thank you, Hidden. So over the course of this session, you've heard about how India is changing, how China is changing, how disruption is making all of that possible. For our third and final polling question for today, I'll put it up on the screen, and for those of you who were awake at the beginning of the session and are still awake now, you'll recognize this question again. It's the same one we asked at the beginning: where will the fintech disruption come from? And the choices are the same, but we want to see how your opinions have differed. So please pick up your BlackBerry simulator and vote now. Wow, okay, so we've managed to convince a few more people that China will be where the change is. And that's truly what we believe. I mean, me living in Shanghai, I've been there for a decade, and the changes that you can see from the beginning when I had to use my mobile payment system with 5-finger encryption to walk across the street and to pay my rent has changed to a completely online and mobile platform. And that's really the disruption that's happening in Asia that soon will be coming to the West. I know you're saying, Innotribe, how could you give me more than you already have given me for free? You have coffee outside, you have sandwiches here. If you had enjoyed what we talked about today, we've done a report looking at these exact topics that should be coming up on the screen shortly. The platform for disruption, it's available today. It's available on the Innotribe platform. If you'd enjoyed the conversation, please go and download it, take a look through, ask questions, learn. Learn about what the future is going to bring and how it's going to come from China and India. And that's it. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Hayden Shaughnessy, who dialed in from Ireland. Bernard, who dialed in from the right side of the stage. And thank you, the audience, for coming. A couple of housekeeping points. The next session is at 4:30, and exploring real-world disruption scenarios. We'd encourage you, as you exit the room to the right, there's an old school sticker post-it note where you can rate the session. So please do that. Please rate the session. Of course, rate it high. As much as you love these voting devices, please leave them on your chair so other people can use them. Grab some coffee outside, and thank you for coming.